Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar for those who've been invited to submit final applications to CLEAR's Digitizing Hidden Special Collections and Archives, Amplifying Unheard Voices program. I'm Sharon Burney, and I'm a program officer on the CLEAR grants team. And today's session will be focused on designing an achievable, sustainable digitization plan. And in order for us to continue to create great webinar experiences for our applicants and the application process, we've created a couple of polls that will help us continue to strive towards creating even better experiences. So first one we're going to do before we get started today, and then we'll do another one at the end. So I'm going to launch a poll and I appreciate your input. There we go. Okay. Looks like everybody. Yep. Okay. 100% answer. Thank you very much. We're going to start off with some introductions, first to this platform, and then to our presenter for today's webinar. To start off, we want to share some notes about using Zoom during this session. A live transcript is being generated if you'd like to utilize it. To turn on this feature, click the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. However, you're welcome to use chat for general introductions and conversation. If a chat box isn't already displaying on your Zoom screen, you can hover your mouse towards the bottom of the screen and open it manually. In order to send a message to everyone, remember to change the default from all panelists to all panelists and attendees. We ask that you use the separate Q&A box to ask questions. This can be opened the same way as the chat box. Because we have limited time together, please feel free to follow along with the questions as they come in and upvote them to let us know that it would be helpful to you to have them answered live. We'll do our best to answer all of the questions live, but we will also share responses to all questions alongside the recording. This session is being recorded. The slides, Q&A, recording, and transcript will be made available on the Apply for an Award page of our website within the next 2 weeks.
Before we move into our program content, we'd like to center today's conversation by acknowledging that as residents of the U.S., we are speaking to you from unceded land of many Indigenous peoples. We recognize the longstanding history that has brought us to reside on this land, and we seek to have greater understanding of our place within that colonial history. We denounce any acts of terrorism, colonialism, and environmental disregard, both past and present. In particular, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize the original and current caretakers of the land, water, and air where we live, all Indigenous peoples and all their ancestors and descendants. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on their homelands and ask you to join me in acknowledging all Indigenous communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. May this acknowledgement and our ongoing work demonstrate CLEAR's commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat and share a land acknowledgement of the area where you live, if you would like.
During today's session, our hosts will dig into designing an achievable, sustainable digitization plan. We've allotted 90 minutes total for today, and the speaker will pause at the halfway point at 2:45 ET for a quick break during their content. We're hoping for an engaging time of conversation around setting a realistic timeline, digitization, quality control, metadata description access, choosing equipment and systems for access and preservation, choosing appropriate digitization and description standards based on material type and condition, and in-house versus vendor. The plan is to reserve about 25 minutes for Q&A near the end of this session. Both the session co-hosts and CLEAR staff will be available to answer questions at that time. So while you may pose questions throughout using the Q&A box, keep in mind that we may not get to every question as it's asked. Staff will be keeping track and will circle back to any unanswered questions during a dedicated Q&A. In today's session, you'll learn more about the skills and strategies you need to complete the following application tasks: the project details outcome specific to digitization and description, the project details work plan, and the project details capacity.
Now we're glad to turn things over to Emily Galgano, Director of Archives and Collections at Sealaska Heritage Institute. We'll take just a moment to let Emily share her slides and get oriented, and as she does that, please remember that we'll be breaking for 5 minutes at roughly the halfway point.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Emily Galgano. I am the Archives and Collections Director at Sealaska Heritage Institute, or SHI, located in Juneau, Alaska. We are a Native nonprofit founded in 1980 to perpetuate and enhance Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian cultures of Southeast Alaska. In my time here at SHI, I have been the lead on several digitization projects, including a CLEAR Recordings at Risk grant in 2020 and a CLEAR Hidden Collections grant that we'll be finishing up this spring. The Recordings at Risk grant was to digitize a collection of reel-to-reels from a radio broadcast that used to run on our local radio station called Southeast Native Radio that talked about contemporary Indigenous issues of the 70s and 80s. The Hidden Collections grant is to digitize several thousand photographs taken by the Tlingit resident of Angoon and amateur photographer Sio George, who took photos throughout his lifetime documenting daily life. I've written several other grants and digitization projects ranging from as small as just a few cassettes to as large as 40 linear feet worth of videotapes. I also just recently received my Digital Archiving Specialist certification from the Society of American Archivists. I'm here today to talk about designing an achievable and sustainable digitization plan. This is a really important part of preparation for any digitization project, so I'm really excited to be here to talk about my experiences with creating these plans. I will have time for questions both before our break and at the end of our session, but if you would like clarification on a specific point while I'm talking, feel free to put it in that Q&A. I will try to keep my eyes on it as we go, but if I miss something, hopefully the CLEAR team can give me a little nudge. Really quick, I just have my session outline up here. We'll be covering 4 main topics, starting really broad and getting more specific as we go. First, we'll go over what is a digitization plan, then some things to consider before you start writing your plan, then specific information that you'll need to have ready to go to input, and finally a discussion of how to make that plan sustainable and achievable long-term. And I will have some specific examples of things like format and metadata schema that I'll bring up, but I really want to emphasize that there's no one-size-fits-all answer to any of these big questions and big decisions. There are some things that work well for us here at SHI that may not work best for you at your institutions. So what is a digitization plan? Just starting really broad here. A digitization plan, simply put, is a roadmap. This should be your in-depth guide that when you are awarded funding, will get the ball rolling right away. The way I like to think about it is if I write a grant that I want this plan to be written so that if I needed to take a leave of absence or transfer the project to a colleague, or if I left my position, someone else would be able to look at this and jump in and figure out what has been done, what is left to do. And this means that you're going to have a lot of details included and have a way of tracking your progress throughout the project. I want to make sure we're all using the same vocabulary here. A digitization plan is different from a digital preservation policy. Digital preservation policy will guide your institution on all of your digital initiatives, and a digitization plan will guide your project team on a specific digitization goal. That said, if your institution does have a digital preservation policy, your plan should fit within the realms of that policy. For example, Most policies will dictate specific file formats that are accepted as either accessions or born digital materials or for digitization projects. Your digitization plan shouldn't go rogue. And if you feel that file formats are incorrect or should be changed for your specific project, then maybe that policy should be reviewed and potentially even updated. A digitization plan is not so different from other types of project management plans that you may write for any grant or project. In terms of what is required for the CLEAR grant proposal, the digitization plan will include your outcomes, your work plan, your capacity, subcontracts. And a big part of that is setting your realistic timelines, choosing the correct equipment and systems of access and preservation, choosing digitization and description standards, and deciding whether to do the digitization work in-house or with a vendor. And we're going to be covering pretty much all of this today. So a little bit more details, kind of your outcomes. The outcomes are the actual results of your projects. When it's time to submit your final reporting, what will you be bringing to the table to show the success of your project? And this is largely going to be based on the goal of your project. And with some projects, that goal is just to digitize one specific set of tapes, and others, it's going to be a much larger project. I always like to think about these outcomes in terms of SMART goals. I have some examples up here. You want to make sure all of your goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. For example, that means your specific goal is to digitize a collection of cassette tapes and write a finding aid for it. It's measurable because you can say that there are 400 cassette tapes in that collection and one finding aid that you're going to write from it. It's achievable in that the collection's not so large, it's not going to be impossible to get through all of those tapes because you have the staff and the equipment to manage that project. And it's relevant because it relates to the specific mission of your institution, and the resulting digital files are maybe frequently requested by researchers and you don't have a way to give access to those yet. And it's time bound because you know it's going to take 2 years, say, and you're putting in the commitment to make sure it's done within that 2-year period. Your outcomes are also going to be either tangible or intangible. Tangible outcomes are a little bit easier to quantify. That's going to be things like how many physical digital files you have made accessible, the actual number, as well as any finding aids or lesson plans, videos that are generated from this, or articles that are written about the process. All of those are tangible things that you could hand a copy of to in your final reporting. And they're pretty simple to quantify. You can measure those pretty easily. But you also have to think about the intangible outcomes. In this case, one example would be community impact, and that's a lot harder to quantify. So when you're thinking about your outcomes, how will you quantify an intangible outcome like community impact? That could be involving doing a survey with your audience, with your patrons, or tracking your research requests. If you're going to track research requests, you have to make sure there's time at the end of the project where the actual digital files are already out and in the public, and you've conducted outreach so that people know to even request them, so you can measure those reference requests. When we digitized a collection of tapes, we heard from some dance groups that had been featured in those tapes from the 80s that their existing dance groups now that had new members were actually watching that footage and relearning the dances that they had forgotten over time that hadn't been passed down to the new generation of dancers. That's really hard to measure. How do we measure that? In that particular case, we ended up collecting commentary from direct correspondence with the dance groups, as well as comments in our related social media posts, and compiling them. It's not quite a number, but it does give us some sense of how many people are impacted by this project. We also want to think about your work plan. This is going to be spelling out step by step what the project is and how it will be achieved. We'll be talking a lot about all of these different things in more detail throughout the session today, but that's going to include things like your schedule or your timeline, the activities that are going to be actually physically done by your staff, you or a vendor, the people that are going to be involved at your institution, the partners and collaborators outside of your institution, the technology that you'll be using, risk mitigation, how you're going to assess the materials afterwards or assess your project, and the sustainability of your project. Project details the capacity. Capacity can mean a few things, including who on your team will be involved in the project, but we're going to talk about that more specifically in our next section. For now, I want to also point out that capacity can mean more than just that, the people that are involved in your project. You also want to be able to show that your project team has the ability to do the work outlined in your work plan. So think about what similar projects has your team conducted and what areas of expertise you can draw upon. Are there past projects that have made collections accessible? What was the success of that? And that doesn't necessarily just mean digitization, but how have you made physical collections accessible? All of that's going to show that your team has experience with working with collections and making them available to the public. That's capacity. Additionally, you may want to show how your institution will grow its capacity because of this project. Maybe you've not done a digitization project of this scale before. So how will this project be designed in a way that builds capacity? For example, will this project include professional development for your full-time staff? Will your storage capabilities be increasing? What policies are going to be created or updated or reviewed? Think about what knowledge will be gained by the project team and by the community at large. Subcontracts, this is going to be your external vendors. Think outside of your institution. For example, we're talking about digitization vendors, but also if you're going to work with transcribers or translators or sound engineers or publishers. We have worked with all of these different types of organizations before. External transcribers who are able to hear, especially things in native languages and being able to write those out. We've also had to work with sound engineers before, where we've had tapes of such poor sound quality that even when they're digitized, you can't get much audio from them. So working with sound engineers who are able to try to edit that to make it more actually listenable for example, those transcribers or translators. This can also relate to capacity because even if you're a really small organization, you can still do big projects as long as you have a little bit of outside help. And so we're going to talk more specifically about the decision to do the digitization work in-house or with a vendor in just a few minutes. Before we jump into the specifics, there are a few things to think about before you begin compiling your digitization plan. These are things that you should discuss with your project team in order to be fully prepared for the details you will need further on. Basically, I see these as things as good discussions to have prior to writing a digitization plan. Because if they change, you're going to end up having to rewrite a lot of your content, and you don't want to be rewriting. When you're getting ready to write your digitization plan, you first really need to consider what the collection is that's going to be digitized. There are a lot of things that will depend on the nature of the collection chosen. I know you'll be hearing more about this type of consideration in other webinars if you're doing the rest of these with Clear, so I won't go into too much detail here. However, some things to think about are what is the importance of the chosen collection to the community that it represents? This can be important because you want to be sure that the digitized collection will be regularly accessed and used. A digitized collection that is never accessed, never used, is very easily forgotten about, and then it's not kept up when you need to transfer file formats or do checksums. You don't ever remember that collection. Does appropriate description exist, or do you need to process further? In my Recordings at Risk grant with the radio recordings, we already had item level descriptions of the reel-to-reels based on the descriptions on individual reel cases that were provided by the donor. This was really helpful in multiple ways. For one, the metadata could be easily added onto existing item records that we already had in our database. And two, quality control was infinitely easier. We were able to identify issues right away. There was one reel that had supposedly an interview about Tlingit culture described, but when the digitizing company returned the files, they had flagged that one for us to check because the audio clearly didn't match the description we gave them. It was instead a children's program with a song about cats. So that one was obvious, but it really helped us when we were going through all of the digital files to have descriptions to compare to. On the other side, in our current Hidden Collections grant, we are working with a photograph collection that had no real description at all, aside from the fact that it was generally organized in chronological order by decade. This can still be an achievable project, though, because a good chunk of our digitization plan also involved working with elders and community members to help identify the people, places, and events photographed in these images. That can impact your timeline. Our Recordings at Risk grant was much shorter timeline than our Hidden Collections grant. So that's why it's important to know what sort of description you have. How much time do you actually need to allot to description in your project? Do you have the right to use and share these materials? Again, speaking from my own experience here, the Recordings at Risk grant consisted of radio recordings that had been publicly broadcast. The radio station had donated the materials with the intention of them being shared publicly. And when we applied for funding, we checked in with the station again to confirm that they were okay with us putting them online. With the photographs, we have the permission from the donation agreement with the photographer's family to share the materials, but since we did not have item level descriptions of the images, there was always a chance that there could be photos of sacred or closed practice events. This was another reason why we chose to include the time with elders and community members to look at the images to make sure we had the opportunity to confirm that any images that are posted online or shared out are not going to cause harm to the intended audience. Understanding the rights and responsibilities you have for a collection you are digitizing can have a big impact on how you design your digitization plan. Lastly here, what formats are included in this collection? This is a huge consideration because it will impact how you decide to get the materials digitized. A collection that is entirely composed of cassette tapes may be easier to digitize in-house, especially if you already have good equipment for digitizing cassettes. A collection that has 3 or 4 different formats like DVC Pro, cassettes, and reels would require multiple types of equipment and expertise to digitize. Let's talk about this a little bit more on our next slide. Because the next big picture question to consider is, will you do the digitization work in-house or with a vendor? So here are some questions to help guide that decision that I have here. Do you have existing equipment and qualified staff to operate it? Is that equipment and software up to current standards? Will newly purchased equipment and software have a use beyond this project? Do you have existing policies for using the equipment, generating or embedding metadata, quality control, etc., other policies? Do you have any damage or dirty materials and or the staff expertise to handle those issues that may come up? Here at SHI, we've chosen to use an external vendor for all of our recent digitization projects, and I just want to go through a few of the reasons why we have chosen to do so based on some of these questions that we asked ourselves. One, we have collections that were digitized in-house by previous staff members from a decade or so ago, that while they were sufficient in some ways, they were not high enough quality given the low quality of the originals for transcription and translation works. This is that cassette collection I mentioned earlier where we had a sound engineer actually work on it. That's because the original digitization work wasn't good enough, and so we had to redigitize those tapes and get them done professionally so a sound engineer could work with them to improve that sound quality. But we don't want to be always redigitizing things, and so that's one of the reasons we've chosen to mostly work with external vendors who have professional equipment. Equipment is another reason why we haven't in recent years done in-house. We would have needed to purchase a large variety of equipment for our collections. Just in our audio visual side of things, we have DVC Pro, Betacam, Betamax, VHS, reels, cassettes, and more. So while we have a lot of different types of materials in our vault, we also don't have an inexhaustible amount. So we saw that pretty quickly, once we were done digitizing, say the collection that had most of the Betacam and Betamax tapes, we weren't going to need that equipment for those specific tapes anymore. Our workspace is limited. We have very limited small workroom, and we didn't want to add in more and more types of equipment that had less than a 5 to 10 year lifespan, of use span. And lastly, staff time. We are a very small department of a much larger institution. There's only 3 positions in the Archives and Collections department, and I'm the only one of those that focuses on the archive side of things rather than the objects. Realistically, I would not have been able to spend all day every day scanning photographs, even if we did purchase a high-speed overhead scanner to make the process go faster. All of this is not to say that you should always work with a vendor rather than doing work in-house. Like I said in the beginning, some things that work for SHI may not work for your institution. In previous positions I've held, we've done the digitization work in-house. An example would be when I was a student worker and a special collections, I took part in a long-term project to digitize the alumni records. This project made sense to do in-house because we had one of those high-tech, high-speed overhead scanners. It was very easy to learn. And since I was there for the beginning of the project, my fellow student workers and I wrote a standard operating procedure for how to set up the scanner for that project and how to do every step of the process. Thanks to the student worker program at the school, there's always student workers who are assigned to that department, and they required minimal training beyond that standard operating procedure. So there was always people who are able to do the work without all of those competing tasks that come up with other duties as assigned from the regular staff, full-time staff that worked there. And because there was already people that were always able to do the work and there was equipment that was able to do the work, there was then no need to coordinate shipping logistics for such a huge collection. And the purchase scanner was something that would be used for plenty of other projects, both before, during, and after the Alumni Files project. So just overall, that project made way more sense to do in-house than to ship out to a vendor. So it's really important to just assess all of the different aspects of your project and decide, are you going to work with an external vendor or can you do the work in-house? If you do decide to work with an external vendor, I have some things here to think about. To start off, has your institution worked with any digitization vendors before? And how was that experience? Do you have any neighboring institutions you can talk to? Who have they worked with? If the experiences were good with previous partners, it's good to check in with them first to get quotes. You can keep that relationship going. You may still want to get multiple quotes and talk to different vendors, and there may be some that offer different or better services, so it's always good to get multiple quotes even if you do intend to go with someone you've worked with before. But depending on your formats, you may actually have to go to another vendor because not all vendors work with all media types. Some specialize in audio, some specialize in photographs. It's all different equipment, so there may be different vendors that have different specialties that will work better for your collection. You also want to think about where is the vendor. I live up in Alaska, and so that's a big question of how are we going to get our materials to the chosen vendor. Even when we work with a partner located here in Alaska, I live in Juneau, which is only accessible by plane or boat. So if their vendor is located in Anchorage, I still have to coordinate shipping logistics to get on a plane all of those materials to Anchorage. Another vendor we work with is in Kentucky, which is an even bigger challenge to get materials to. When speaking with your vendors or your potential vendors, here's a list of questions you might want to ask them. Have they done projects of this size and scope before? Have they worked with this media type before? Have they worked with clear grants before? Do they have different specs than what you request, things like format type or resolution type? If they do, why is that? Do you need to update your policies, or are they doing something that is something you don't agree with? How long would this project take to complete? And would they be able to start right away if you're awarded? These are all important things to ask because you want to make sure that the vendor you're working with has worked with the type of materials you're providing, has worked with the specifications that you need, all of that. Choosing a vendor is a really important aspect of the project, so make sure you are diligent in following up with them and asking as many questions as you can think of. Once a vendor is chosen, you also want to make sure to keep them in the loop throughout your grant writing process. We've found that many of the vendors we've worked with are willing to write letters of commitment with descriptions of their equipment and their processes, which can be a great addition to the proposal. You also want to keep them informed so you don't lose your place in the queue. You don't want them to be surprised because they haven't heard from you in months, but now you're ready for them to start and they didn't even know you were awarded funding, so they took on other projects. So keeping them in the loop as well, very important. Okay, the last big picture item here, who will be involved on the project? This is good to consider before you get too far along in the process, because bringing the project team together sooner only makes sure your plan is as accurate as possible. Do you have the staff capacity? And this doesn't just mean that you have people who are interested in participating in the project, but do they actually physically have the time to do so? Like I mentioned earlier, we do not have the capacity to do much in-house digitization here where I work, because as the only archives-focused position, I also do all of the accessioning, processing, reference, and department management. So there's not time for a large-scale in-house digitization project in my workload. I do have the capacity to manage projects and coordinate with external vendors. So understanding the staff capacity helps to dictate who can and who should be involved in a project. You should also think about what protocols you need to follow. I have an example here about media department staff. That's because here at SHI, we have a media department that is in charge of all of our media. That includes online content, graphic design, videos, videography, photographs, everything. So when we have a project that involves posting videos to our YouTube channel or other social media, we have to include their staff time in our digitization plan. Are there staff in other departments who can assist? Is there, say, an education department that could assist with writing lesson plans or connecting you to schools for projects where you see students as the main audience? Will you have interns or temporary project staff involved? And how quickly are those positions filled at your institution? Here in Alaska, it can be a real challenge to hire temporary staff, especially if they would have to temporarily relocate up here. That's a big difference from when I lived in a big city in the lower 48, where there was a library school, and there were a lot of grad students who were always looking for temporary or intern work, and there's always more of those than there were positions to host them. So being aware of your institution's needs and abilities in that respect, that makes a difference too when you're planning. All right, so now we've gone over some of those big picture considerations, things that you need to think about as you're bringing your project team together and deciding on all of these plans. I want to talk about some specifics. This is stuff that you're going to need to really think about and have hammered out while you're writing this digitization plan. We discussed equipment and software broadly, but when you're ready to start writing your digitization plan, you'll need to have a lot more specifics. And there's really kind of two types of equipment and software you should be thinking about. How are you going to digitize the materials, and how will you share the final results? If you're digitizing in-house, how will you do that digitizing? What specific equipment do you need? Do you need to purchase it, or do you have the equipment on hand? And how will you edit the resulting digital files? You may need to alter recordings to get better sound, or add watermarks to photos, or increase contrast if you're doing scanning onion skin paper and you want to make sure it's actually legible. Do you have the software and the expertise needed to do that editing post-digitization? For sharing out the results, do you have an online database with public-facing access? Or will you use social media, or is there some other way you're planning to share out these materials? Do you need to purchase software to accomplish this? We use Rediscovery by Proficio, or Proficio by Rediscovery as our collections database. It has a front-end database for members of the public to access, and it's really easy to share photographs and audio files directly in the database. So people can search the database, find a finding aid, and pull up the audio that's related to it. But video files are really large, and they don't really work that well on the database. So generally it makes sense to upload those to YouTube, and then we provide a link in the database in the finding aid that links to that YouTube page. We also store copies of all of our access copies on external hard drives that can be used by visitors in person, as well as a backup if the YouTube page is down. So when you're writing your digitization plan, you need to have your outreach methods figured out so you know what technology may be required. Do you have existing databases that can do public-facing access? Is that something you need to consider purchasing? Do you have a social media page that's really active that you can use to share things? Are there other ways that you're going to share these materials out? Do you have hard drives for in-person researchers who want to access these things? All of that, good questions to have. Also, if you have any equipment already, do you have staff that are trained on how to use those items, those equipment, that software? And do you have time or ability to train staff before the grant begins? Because that can be a really helpful thing to add in before you get even funding, to already have practiced and tried out these things so you don't end up with any surprises on day one. After you've brainstormed about what equipment or software is needed, you can take stock of what you already have and what you need to purchase. If you already own the equipment and software, as I said, is the project staff trained on it already? Can you train them before the grant begins, or do you need to include training in your timeline? If you're purchasing equipment or software, you should check multiple sources to get multiple quotes. If you have IT support at your institution, now is also the time to check in with them. Is this equipment or software something you will need their help with? At my institution, we're not able to download any software without an IT person virtually there to plug in the admin passwords. And our administration also requires that all large tech purchases need to be approved by IT staff. So it may seem like a small thing to check in that the scanning software you want to purchase is okay, but it would really stink if that was the holdup once you started the project, that you just picked the wrong software and now they need to go through a bunch of different cost and benefit analyses of different software services because they didn't like the one you picked. So with that in mind, you want to make sure they don't have any blocks against certain types of software, or that the equipment you are purchasing is compatible with any computer systems that you use. And you should be prepared to explain to your IT or your administration or whoever approves these purchases. You should be able to explain what the software or equipment is and why you need that specific one. You may want to have analyses to share with them in advance. So when we purchased our online database system with Proficio, we put together a document showing all of the upfront and ongoing costs for it, as well as the benefits of the one we had chosen, and compared it to other similar products out there. I also have a note here to check in with your networks. If you're considering purchasing equipment or software, it would also be a good idea to reach out to institutions in your community to see if anyone has experience with either of those things. And partly that's for a couple of reasons, just to see if they have good experience versus bad experience. But it's also just good to talk to your neighboring institutions. Maybe they already have the equipment and they can work out an MOU or some other understanding or agreement where you could use their equipment. Or if you had it, would they use it? That sort of thing. I also, in the resources slide at the very end of this presentation, I have a few listservs and forums listed. And they can be a good place to ask people's expertise, experience working with these things as well. So when deciding how you want to store your digital files, a lot of the same considerations apply as for other equipment and software. Talking to your IT can be helpful, especially if you're able to work out a way that they can help support the long-term storage of your files. When discussing a recent upgrade option for our digital storage, our IT had a completely different idea of how to do so than I did. And because of that open communication that we had, we went with a system called the QNAP system to replace our RAID storage devices. And that was a really helpful kind of open communication moment for us. I have a list here of some different types of storage. Most of the earlier digitization projects done here a decade or so ago, such as the in-house cassette digitization I mentioned, stored their digital files on CDs and DVDs. And while these were good for providing access copies to researchers, 10 years ago, most computers don't come with a CD drive anymore, and we have to use external CD drives to access those items. Now that some of our new laptops don't even have USB ports, we need an adapter to use the external CD drive. They're also not good for long-term storage of master or preservation copies. There can be other issues too. Part of that recordings at risk grant to digitize the Southeast Native Radio recordings collection, I had to rip digital files from CDs. There had been a second part of the donation where they had already digitized the reels and put all of the digital files on CDs and donated just the CDs, not those original reels. We only had CD copies, so it was the only version we could get of the audio. But they had been stored in plastic sleeves that had started to degrade. So part of the whole process was also carefully cleaning all of that sticky residue off of the CDs before we could even rip them. So that's an issue that may come up with things like CDs and DVDs. Thumb drives have a lot of the same issues as CDs, including, as I mentioned, the soon-to-be defunct USB port. Hard drives are really good for access copies. It's how we store a lot of our access copies, so we can easily bring them out for an in-person researcher or send copies to remote researchers. The important thing is to make sure only access copies are stored on that hard drive. So if a researcher corrupts the files by not properly ejecting the hard drive, you're not putting your preservation or master copies at risk. Depending on the brand and the drive specs, you may need to replace these every 1 to 5 years. So check your specifications on your hard drives and make sure you're tracking when they were purchased, when they were put in use, and when they need to be updated. RAID storage devices are like hard drives, but there are multiple drives in one device that serve as backups. These are what we used for a long time, and we still use some of them that have life left in them because they have nice high storage capacity and they have built-in backups. It's a really good starting point for digital storage. They do still need to be replaced about every 5 years. So ultimately, we have moved away from those because we have so much storage required that it's no longer sustainable to keep replacing that many RAID storage devices every 5 years. An internal server, this is where you would definitely need to talk to your IT. Essentially, this is what we've worked out with our IT with this new system. They've had to upgrade our server room and put the archive storage on its own system, separate from the rest of the network that the institution is on. So only I and IT have access to that storage. For cloud storage, there are pros and cons. It is secure in the sense that you don't have to worry about a single drive or server going out of commission and losing everything. There are other considerations like maintaining the rights to your materials, and as well as ongoing costs of what are essentially membership fees. There are other digital storage solutions out there, so the key will be finding a solution that fits your current institutional needs and funding capabilities, but also providing the best, most secure storage that you can. The thing to remember with digital storage is that there's no such thing as a permanent solution. You can't just set it and forget it. Even the new system we have installed will have to be updated within 8 to 10 years. And digital storage changes all the time. There are so many options out there, and the thing is, none of these options are bad per se. They each have their uses. I still use thumb drives all the time when a researcher needs a high-resolution copy of something for publication use. Sometimes it's just easier than trying to send a copy via Dropbox, and you're always going to have that older patron who doesn't understand how thumb drives work, and so having some CDs that you're able to rip onto can be helpful in those situations as well. When you are deciding on your storage needs, try to think about it in terms of needing 3 copies of every file. There's your master copy, a preservation copy, and an access copy. The master copy will be the highest resolution that you can get. It should be stored separately from the others on your most secure and stable storage option, and it should basically be kept untouched. Your preservation files should still be the highest resolution that you can get, but they're the ones that you're going to work with when you're embedding metadata or updating to a new file format or doing checksums, creating access copies, and otherwise conducting any preservation actions on a file that should be on your preservation file, not your master file. This essentially makes sure that you always have a master copy as a backup if something goes terribly wrong in the preservation file while you're making an access copy. In your access copies, they should be lower resolution. You can edit them, you can add watermarks, share them with researchers, post them online, etc. I like to store them on things that are easy to access, like on our general network drive or on hard drives that are stored in my office. Even if they're available on our online database, I do keep an access copy on a hard drive as well as a backup. All right, so this table I've put up here has the formats that we use here at SHI for our master preservation and access copies. This is also what we request from our digitization vendors, though we usually just ask for one high resolution and one low resolution copy, and then we make our preservation copies from our master copies once they arrive. For audio files, we ask for WAV and MP3 copies. For our visual or video files, we ask for AVI and MP4. Photos, we request TIFFs and JPEGs, and documents, we ask for PDFs all the way through. As I've said, there is no one-size-fits-all option here, so use these as a starting point or talk to your vendors and to your IT department, what are their suggestions. But you do want to make sure that whatever you decide, you try to keep as much standardization as possible within your institution, because you don't want it changing from project to project where you ask for one version of these types of files for access copies this project, and then the next project, you're going to completely change that. So try to think about something standardized, because that's going to help make sure that everything is easy to work with down the road. The next detailed information you need to have ready when you're preparing your digitization plan is your metadata schema. On the top there, I've listed just a few options, ideas. We use Dublin Core mostly here, though we are working on incorporating more premise and TK labels as well. There's so many different types of metadata schema you can use, but try to think about it also in the fact that you likely already generate some sort of metadata for your physical collections. Even if that's just descriptive metadata in the form of a finding aid, metadata for digital collections is really just taking it to that next step. When deciding on what metadata schema to use, think about what metadata schema or description methods you already use and how are they incorporated into your collections already. How can you enhance those to add more information about your digital files? And how is that metadata incorporated into your collections management system? For us, since we use mostly Dublin Core, we're able to incorporate directly into our database. Proficio does not use the exact same terminology as the Dublin Core elements, but you can map it really easily from one to the other. And when you're thinking about what is digital metadata, digital preservation metadata, that's where premise is going to come in, and that's going to be tracking things like the format, the original file format, any transitions that have been made over the years, as well as when it was digitized, and who it was digitized by, what equipment was used, what software was used. All of that can be embedded into the files, and it can be a good way of tracking. So that's what I mean by the next step of there's descriptive metadata, and then there's the next step, which is tracking what has been done to that file. The best practice would be to embed it, but you don't have to. If you have a way of associating that metadata with a file, and you want to put that into your descriptive metadata, that works fine as well. Proficio has been really helpful for us with metadata creation because they were able to help us to design Excel templates that match the fields in Proficio that we could then map to the Dublin Core elements. And by doing that, we're able to mass import metadata at the item level. And that's why I have this last bullet point here on the slide is talking to your vendor, because if you are working with one, because if you can give a vendor a template like that, and they can track all of the information because most vendors are going to track some sort of information for you anyway. You can then receive that Excel template and import it directly into your database, or at least that's what we have been able to do. And it has made a lot of this process much, much smoother. And as an example, I have put up here a template example of one of our Excel sheets. This is more of the descriptive side of things than on the preservation side, but it was used in a summer intern project this past year. By using templates like this, we're able to spell out the exact information we want embedded in the item record on our online database, and it allows us to do mass imports. Instead of manually updating each individual record on our database, we can use this template to import hundreds of records at a time. This particular example, as I said, is more descriptive, but the concept is the same. When we want to track our checksums or other preservation actions, we can add that as a column on our template, and we can update that record the same way, and it tracks it under different fields in our database. We can send blank templates like this to our vendors or to our team if the work is being done in-house, and they can easily fill it out as they're completing their work. For things with standardized lexicons like the category tab column on this, we have drop downs that you can choose from. So it's, you know, pre-filled in, you just pick which one is the most relevant. And then the open text fields like the summary note, you can allow for any text to be input. When we first switched to Proficio back in 2020, this feature was a game changer for us with our digitization and processing projects. If you have an online database, even just an internal one, and maybe it doesn't have a public-facing side, it's worth reaching out to their support team to see if they have the ability to do something similar to this. Okay, before I move on to this last section here about making a digitization plan sustainable, we're going to be taking a short break, but first I wanted to pause and see if there were any questions because we've talked about a lot of things already, and I see some question and answer things. So this first one is, if we choose to utilize digitization equipment from a neighboring peer institution, for example, another university library digitization lab, would we handle that much like we would say another vendor? What if there's no charge for the usage of this equipment? Would we just include that information in the project narrative? We're exploring our options for procuring a large format scanner without purchasing one or shipping our materials to a vendor. Yeah, I think that would be a really good option. If you have a neighboring institution that has equipment already, I would just make sure that you have a formalized like agreement or contract with them to make sure that you're not kind of screwed over down the road if they end up not having the time or the equipment breaks and they don't have it and you don't have a backup option. So making sure you have a formal contract written and probably a letter of commitment that you can attach to your narrative as well. I don't have necessarily a list of digitizing vendors. I can tell you some of the folks that we've worked with in the past. We have a company in Anchorage that we work with called Summit Day Media. So if you're on the West Coast, maybe that would be an option. And then on the East Coast, the Kentucky vendor that we work with, that is Scene Savers. And they have done other reportings at risk grants as well. So they're familiar with CLEAR and their processes, which is why we've worked with them in the past partially. But they also prioritize older formats, which has been really helpful. They are the ones that did our Betacam and Betamax tapes, which is a lot harder to find vendors who can do those. We've also found local vendors. Our radio station actually is able to do some of the newer formats. So if it's on a VHS or a cassette tape, they have the ability to do that type of work. So that's in town and it's less shipping. And then I think these next two might be more clear staff questions. We've got one, they're considering contracting a project archivist to work on the project in-house. Are there any requirements for contractors versus vendors?
Yeah, this is going to be contingent for your specific project needs and sometimes your organizational policies regarding hiring consultants. Some projects it may make more sense to create a job ad and hire an archivist. And if you do this, staffing is an allowable expense. You can include that in your project detail and your narrative. If this is a new hire for the project only, then you upload a job description or ad. Make sure you include the hours. Please, an equitable salary based on where you live and fringe benefits to your budget information, the detail and the narrative. For some organizations and projects, it might make more sense to hire this person as a consultant. And this would also be allowable and included in your budget information. And on our apply for an award page, we have a guidelines for grant proposals involving subcontractors or contracts that you can find. And I think we'll drop that in the chat for you.
Thanks. I think this next one is another clear question. Are internal server upgrades for master or preservation copies an allowable digitization expense for a clear grant?
Sharon, you want to take that one last and then we'll take a break?
Sure. Yeah, we can. That's a tricky question, and that we'll go into more of that during our budget session. So there will be a session specifically on budgets. You can add some based on it. However, you have to be able to sustain that server upgrade after the project. You have to be able to show the reviewers that I can sustain financially this server upgrade after the project period. And that's what they're going to be looking for. So, and also, like, is this just for ingest purposes, and these type of things. So I think that's a little trickier of a question. And if you have a specific upgrade that you want to utilize, I would email us so that we can look at it and make sure it's an allowable expense. And you can always email us at hiddencollections@clear.org with more details, and we'll be able to tell you, yes, you can use this one, and this is the parameters within which you can use it. Sorry.
Hey, y'all, we're going to take a quick 5 minutes and then we'll come back to Emily at 3:02 Eastern. And you can take it away, Emily.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. So now let's talk about what makes our digitization plan actually sustainable, or otherwise just going beyond, well, why don't you just scan everything? All right, so sustainable to me means a few things, namely that a plan is feasible, it is efficient, and at the end of the projects, the results or outcomes have long-lasting effects. A plan that is not feasible or efficient will never be completed in the necessary timeline, or funds will run out, or deliverables compromised. And a plan with no sense of the life of the deliverables after the project is destined to the same end as those CDs I mentioned earlier, forgotten items that develop sticky residue that has to be dealt with down the road by someone else. The difference is that we could clean off those CDs and still access the content. Fully digital storage is not so forgiving when a hard drive fails. One way to ensure that your digitization plan is sustainable is to pack in all of the details. A digitization plan needs to have all of the information needed so the project can move forward with or without you. For example, if you're hiring temporary staff, they should be able to read the grant and know what their role and goals are. Of course, they will still have to be trained in protocols for your institution or on certain equipment, but there shouldn't be confusion about what their day-to-day will look like. And they shouldn't need to go to you for just direction on things like file naming structure or metadata schema. All of those should be standardized and spelled out in your plan. Additionally, your vendors and partners need to be confirmed and informed of the plan and timeline. You also want to think about using the tools that you have. That includes more than just your physical tools. Of course, that's part of it. Think about the software and equipment and storage devices, your databases, your cataloging systems, social media accounts, protocols, standards, etc., all things that you already have. That's not to say that you should never be seeking out new systems and new equipment, but more to say that what new things you seek out should fit into what you already know and use. For example, you don't need to invent a new file naming convention for every new project. We use the same file naming system for our digital files as we do for our physical records, based off of our accession or collection numbers. This way, all of our digital files follow the same naming conventions, and when inevitably our media department sends me a photo I sent them a year or so ago and asks how to credit it, again, I can look up the correct collection information just based off of the file name. And while there will be some things that are individual to each project, I encourage you to think about what aspects can be familiar. If everything is a completely new system and program and equipment, it's just that much more likely that the project will be short-lived beyond the scope of the grant. If you get a storage device that requires a specific person on the IT team to grant you access, that may be a very secure system, but is it really that useful? Will you or your successor down the road really keep up with that maintenance? Instead of inventing new protocols, you may also think about following best practices like DAX and your chosen metadata schema that will help with allowing for continued access and upkeep. I've mentioned our system Proficio a bit already, but working with them and getting training through their support team has been great for growing our skills with our existing technology. Part of the reason using tools and technology that you and your team are familiar with is because long-term access starts with regular access. A phrase I've heard used a lot in the digital preservation field is used data is saved data. As I mentioned last slide, having your digital files stored on a locked down server that only IT has access to may sound like a great and secure way to store your records, but digital files are not like physical files. You can rehouse paper documents in acid-free folders and put them in an acid-free box in a vault with perfect temperature and humidity conditions and expect them to stay relatively unchanged for years to come. This is not the case with digital records, where there are things like bit rot that will occur over time or formats that are no longer supported on new computers. If you've ever tried to open a WordPerfect document off of a floppy disk in the last few years, you know what I'm talking about. CDs and DVDs are not so far behind the floppy disk, and we have no reason to think that the formats we used for those will continue to be accessible in the future. The best way to combat this is to regularly access your materials. That is one of the reasons why choosing a collection with meaning to your patrons and your audience is so important. If patrons are requesting access all the time, it is much easier to stay ahead of data loss. You can also perform checksums to make sure files are not degrading over time. Eventually, you may need to update the file type or format of the preservation and access files to something else that will be more readable by newer computers or software. With some things, you may eventually want to emulate the original file, but that is a little bit rare. An example of emulation would be when video game companies release old games that can be played on new systems. It looks exactly like the original, but there are changes in the background that allow an old computer game to be played on a PlayStation 5, that sort of thing. It looks the same, but fundamentally it's not the same file underneath. So that may be something you need to do in the future if that's the sort of thing that you're digitizing. But that's not going to be something that you do to your master copy. Something else to consider with long-term access is maintaining the originals. The preservation of originals should be included in your digitization plan. It's part of the fail-safe. If the worst happens and electronic files are lost, having the originals as a backup is key. In a less devastating example, technology is always improving. There's always the potential that there will be improvements for materials that are particularly challenging to get quality digital files from, such as the example I shared earlier with the in-house digitized cassette tapes that we redigitized professionally. Technology had also improved in the last 10 years since they were originally digitized. That helped with getting better quality sound the second time around. Thinking about the life of the digitized materials in your collection beyond the scope of this one grant project is key to a sustainable digitization plan. That includes being aware of the ongoing costs that will continue. If you have cloud storage or an online database, these will come with monthly or annual fees in perpetuity. Hard drives and servers need to be replaced regularly and the files transferred. Staff time is necessary to perform checksums and transfer files. In your digitization plan, how can you show that your institution is prepared for the long-term access to these digitized collections? Since consistent access is a key component to long-term access, you also want to think about your outreach plan. Outreach is an important part of the work plan that may seem easy to just toss in a comment about how you will post about it in your institution's Facebook page, and that's that. But it really is a vital part of the long-term sustainability of your project. Think about who your audience is and look at any data your institution has accumulated about reaching that audience. It will come as no surprise, I'm sure, to any of you that Facebook trends with an older audience than Instagram or TikTok. So if you're hoping to encourage college students to use your collection, you may want to be sure to go beyond just Facebook. Like I said earlier, I do not have access to posting directly. Our media department handles all of that. So for me, my outreach plan has to include coordinating with our media department and including their staff time. That means I have to identify posting schedules, find funding for boosted posts, pick themes or holidays to feature a particular digital collection over another, and more things like that. Social media posts and interactions can be a really powerful way to encourage access, but also think beyond that. In our current Hidden Collections grant, we are actually printing a photo book with a portion of the images digitized because the main community represented in the photos is Angoon, which is a tiny and remote village in Southeast Alaska, only accessible by float plane or boat. While it does have internet access, that just isn't the best way to reach the people there. They're not really on Facebook as much. A copy of the book that we eventually produce will go to the community of Angoon, but copies are also going to go to the Alaska Public Library System, which, because there's no public library in Angoon, has a program that flies books out to remote communities by seaplane. So anyone can request a copy of the book from the library's catalog. So that's an outreach plan for a digitized collection that does not necessarily rely on digital access. So think about how creative ways that you may be able to reach your audience that go beyond just posting about it when you finish the project that it's available. Lastly here, do whatever you can to make sure that the collection is both searchable and findable. That means having good, strong metadata and descriptive finding aids and all of that. But also, is your audience familiar with using your database? When we released our Proficio database in 2020, the immediate reaction was confusion, heightened by the fact that we had to immediately transition to remote reference only for a while at the same time, the beginning of the pandemic. To help, we produced videos that I was able to record at home, explaining how to use the database with some tips and tricks. And I really want to highlight findability here because as archivists, sometimes we assume that if we put, the right Library of Congress subject heading here on a finding aid, it fixes all of the searching issues. And while they do help, it is just important to remember that the most findable collection is the one that your audience knows how to search for. So if you're getting comments from your patrons that something should be described a certain way, such as a specific name for a place, it's important to be open to updating our records based on community input over time. Responding to that input is a really good way of building relationships with the community you want to be reaching. So next, let's talk about challenges and risk mitigation. There's always going to be challenges and changes that come up in a project, and a sustainable plan does not pretend that those won't happen, but is prepared for when they do. There could be staff turnover. That's always a possibility. You have to be ready that anybody on your project could not be on your project by the time it's awarded or halfway through the project. And so do you have someone else who can fill that position? Is there somebody, how quickly are people hired? Do you have time built in that there can be breaks where there's maybe nobody able to work on the project because there's no staff person in that position? Building in that time is important. Vendor availability. Just as an example, we had a problem with one of our digitization vendors where they said they would be able to do the work. They, gave us their word they were able to do it. And then at the end of the day, they never had anybody hired in the position that could do the work that we needed them to do. And we ended up having to put off, and eventually we went with another vendor that we had to find kind of last minute. So it could happen. We did all the things you're supposed to do. We had an agreement with them, and they just didn't have anybody on staff in that position, and there was nothing we could do about it. So we had to find somebody else to take up that slack, and that changed the way our project timeline had to go, because all of a sudden we went from a much larger institution to a smaller vendor that was a one-man show that was able to do the work, but took quite a bit longer to do so. You also want to think about broken, dirty, or damaged formats. We have a project that's for a celebration project, which is a biennial event that happens every other year here at SHI, started in 1982. That's where all those Betacam and Betamax tapes come from. And when the first ones from the 80s were digitized, our vendor found that they were absolutely filthy, and they couldn't get any content from them until they manually cleaned the tapes. That ended up taking a lot longer than we thought it would, because no one was expecting that issue. When we later had to digitize more Betacam and Betamax tapes, we built in extra time in our timeline because we knew that that would be a possibility. Similarly damaged, reel-to-reels are particularly prone to snapping their film and having breaks in the film, making sure you're budgeting time and ability by your vendor to fix those issues. Are they able to splice them? Are they still able to digitize fragments? All of that sort of thing. You also want to think about, with our Recordings at Risk grant during the pandemic, we were awarded pretty much right after everything shut down. And the budget and timeline had to change drastically because, as I mentioned, we have to ship everything out, and shipping from Juneau to Kentucky suddenly became about twice as expensive than it had been prior when we actually budgeted out in our application. So these are things that could come up. I encourage you to think about challenges that have come up in other projects, whether they are digitization projects or not. There are challenges that are going to cross all boundaries of types of projects. Think about those things that have come up, think about those issues, and how would you react to that? What can you do to prevent that from derailing your project to such an extent that you have to, get an extension? Okay, now for timelines. I really want to emphasize here that this project that you're applying for is very likely not your only task. When you are awarded this, it is much more likely that you will have to continue to attend to your regular duties and your other duties as assigned. So when you're making your timeline, don't just measure how long it takes you to scan one photo and scale that up to the number of photos in your collection and decide that you can do that for 3 hours every day for the next 6 months. That can be a good starting point, but it only really scratches the surface. So make sure you're budgeting in extra time around all of these things, because you're going to have other tasks that come up in your day-to-day. You're going to be able to have to do other work. You also want to think about, is the collection fully processed to the item level? Is that work you're going to be doing during the project? Make sure you're budgeting enough time for that. Do you have detailed metadata templates for the digitization company? Or what content are they going to be sending you back? What material are they sending you back? What information are you going to get from them that you can then turn into metadata? Make sure you're including the time it takes to purchase packing materials and conduct thorough condition reports. That is easy to overlook. A condition report may take you just a few minutes to do for one tape, but if you have 400, 500 tapes, now it becomes a lot bigger of an issue. And that includes condition reports for when they return from your vendor, or even from your own in-house digitization lab. If you have one, you should still be reviewing all of your tapes to make sure nothing was damaged during the process. As well as including time for safely packing those materials and shipping them to the digitization company. Like I said, that took a lot longer once we shut down for the pandemic, and I was only in the office once a week, and I had to pack all of those materials and send them to Kentucky. It took a lot longer than we budgeted, so make sure you're adding in extra time. You also want to add in extra time for your digitization company and have backup plans. They may tell you it's going to take 3 months to do some work, but you should probably be budgeting at least double that, because that will include time for shipping. That'll include time if they end up having to bump your project to lower on their priority list. Just there are things to consider in that you should be thinking about. You also want to include time to review. You should be checking all of the returned physical items and the digital files, all of the metadata, any products. You need to be reviewing all of that. What quality control are you doing? How are you going to check that your radio recording of a very important interview has not really been, recorded over and is now a children's program? You need to make sure you're taking the time to review that before it goes live on your online database. And you also need to make sure you're including time to update your database, to attach and update metadata, to document your successes and the challenges of the project. You always want to make sure you're budgeting more time than you need for all of these things. The first large grant that I ever wrote included hiring a project archivist to process a large collection, and we scheduled a month to find someone, and it ended up taking a lot longer than that. Am I out of time?
Yeah, we'll need to move to Q&A real quick. So if they're
All right.
up in a couple minutes, then we'll move towards that.
I'll be quick.
Emily.
I just wanted to put up here a Gantt chart schedule. I find these to be really helpful when I'm budgeting out my time for a project, to make sure that I'm tracking that there's no other big events happening at the same time. We have a big event that happens every other year called Celebration, and from April to June, we are pretty much booked. So I don't want to have anything in those time frames to be doing for digitization work. And the last thing that I want to say is to make sure that we are documenting everything. It's all well and good to have a nice timeline and writing it all out on paper. Once the project actually begins, that all goes out the window. You have to make sure if you're not keeping track. So have monthly meetings, follow your schedule. If you have a project management system, use it, and make sure you're creating documentation, not just for your grant team, or for your final reporting, but for yourself, so that when you go to future projects, you can see what worked and what didn't, and who was a good project vendor. All of that stuff is really important to be tracking as you're going along, because you're not going to remember it 5 years down the road when you're applying for something else. All right. Questions? Here's my resources slide as well.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Emily. I'll hand it over to our program officers who will field a few questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Here is one. Is it an option to digitize half of our materials with a flatbed scanner? We would purchase artworks mainly and continue to use and outsource the remaining materials, sound paper, files, organizational and archival material.
I would say, at least from the perspective of doing projects, we've done that before. I'm not sure if Clear allows that specifically, but if there are some vendors that only work with specific types of materials, and so you may have to work with multiple vendors.
Emily, this is another question I think straight to you. How did you feel about your own capacity expertise to do your project while applying to the grant, and did you find it was a learn as you go experience?
Definitely some of my earliest grants that I wrote, that was maybe 5-6 years ago. I don't think I quite understood about what capacity meant exactly. So it's definitely been a learning experience, but now I feel like as I'm looking at projects, I can see, and I know what my day-to-day looks like, and what my areas of expertise are. I can kind of tell pretty easily when something's going to be outside the realm of what I personally am capable of handling, which is when I then need to start looking for a vendor or temporary staff or part-time staff to join on the team as well. Yeah.
This is a quick one I'm going to take. This is really a Clear question, but what is the expected reporting schedule for Clear? We do a report every 12 months. So if you have a 3-year project, you'll have to do 3 reports. You have 1 full project year and then 2 months for reporting. So there's 2 months after your first year for your first report, 2 months after your second year for your second report, and for your final report, you get an additional month. So it'll be 3 months after the close of your project.
We do not have a deed of gift for the collection we are proposing to digitize, only a newspaper article from the local paper stating that she donated her collection to us upon her death, which was in 1991. Is it a requirement that we have a signed deed of gift? And if so, I will track down the next of kin and see if they will sign one. Which is going to be also a great plug for our rights, ethics, and reuse session that will be coming up. Emily, did you want to give some advice before I give them the clear answer?
I would say if you can get a signed deed of gift, it's always better. That's my rule of thumb. I hesitate sometimes with digitizing materials that we don't have very firm ownership of, because you don't want to go through all of this work and then have somebody tell you to take it down.
And make sure you clarify all of that with the reviewers will be looking to see that you do have a great understanding of your rights, that for the most part you own and hold them. And secondly, that you do have a takedown policy in place in case something should arise. So that was great.
Oh, we got one last one. Working with the Tribal Association, we have proposed sorting, arranging, digitizing, and describing textual materials. Many of these are original field notes, logs, translations, and transcriptions. We would like to include metadata, records, updates that relate these textual materials to audio, video, and images. Just want to make sure we can include this record linking and record updating as part of the digitization costs. Probably. This would be a matter of how you design your work plan. But if this is part of the processing of the digital materials, I think this could be an allowable cost if it's built into the workflow. Would you agree with that, Sharon?
Yes, as long as it's part of the reparation to and it's not extensive amount of your budget, yes, it would be allowable.
Yeah. So that's all the questions.
So we have another poll. We have one more poll.
Yeah, we'll do another poll to gauge how you're feeling now after this webinar about today's topic. If you can take a moment to fill that out now. All right, seeing a few more coming in. All right, I think we have a good result there. Thank you so much for your participation and feedback. As you work on your final application, remember that there will be 3 additional sessions over the next month. The next one will be on April 3rd, and we'll address those rights, ethics, and reuse questions you brought up. You can sign up for that on our apply for an award page. And we just want to say we're so glad that you were able to join us today. And we want to extend a huge thanks to Emily for leading. As we continue our assessment of the program, we appreciate your continued feedback. We'll share the link to the survey for today's webinar, and we look forward to hearing how the session went, what you might like to see in future sessions, and how we might improve. Please don't hesitate to send questions to the Career Grants team as they come up between now and the final submission deadline of May 8th. And as needed, our team can also consult with Emily if you have other specific questions on today's topic. We thank you so much, and we hope to see you at another session soon.